You see, there is a unique kind of strength in the world that isn't loud, that doesn't demand attention, yet changes everything it touches. It's quiet, unwavering, and deeply magnetic. This is the energy of the super empath, and it's precisely this strength that causes someone who runs from intimacy, the avoidant, to feel unsteady, even afraid. Why is that? Because the super empath holds a mirror, not a judgment, not a threat, but a mirror. And when the avoidant looks into it, they see the emotions they've hidden, the parts of themselves they've locked away. They see the vulnerability they thought they could control or avoid. And in that moment, something stirs inside them: recognition, fear, and the undeniable truth that running won't protect them anymore. Avoidants have built entire worlds around control. They believe if they can distance themselves from emotion, if they can rationalize, deflect, or detach, they are safe. But when a super empath enters the room, safety is redefined. Calm, grounded, unwavering presence meets their walls, and suddenly those walls feel exposed, unnecessary, fragile. What they perceive as strength is challenged. What they cling to as independence is questioned. There is a divine principle at work here. The universe often sends people into our lives who reflect our untamed potential, who reveal what is possible when we shed fear and embrace truth. The super empath does not demand surrender, they embody it. And this embodiment, pure, authentic, emotionally fearless, calls to the avoidant in a way that is both terrifying and transformative. Fear is not weakness, it is a sign of awakening. Avoidants fear the super empath because the super empath shows them that true strength is not in hiding, but in feeling. True courage is not in detachment, but in connection. And in the very moment the avoidant realizes this, the walls begin to tremble. The defenses that once felt protective now feel limiting. The very identity they've crafted as a shield is challenged, not to harm them, but to set them free. This is the divine paradox. What they fear most is what they need most. To feel deeply, to surrender, to confront the shadows within. That is not weakness, that is evolution. That is the awakening of the heart, the expansion of the soul. And so, when you encounter someone who cannot hide from your light, who can see past every mask, who feels beyond the superficial, it is not rejection you face, but revelation. Do not run from this. Do not fear it. Allow it to guide you. Embrace it. The emotional strength of the super empath is a gift disguised as a challenge. It is a call to courage, a call to honesty, a call to love yourself enough to dismantle the walls you once thought protected you. And in that dismantling, in that surrender, you will discover something extraordinary: freedom, connection, and a heart wide enough to experience life in its fullest, most beautiful truth. When a super empath enters the life of an avoidant, there is a subtle, almost invisible force at work, one that the avoidant may not even consciously recognize at first. This is the mirror effect, a phenomenon where the empath's emotional presence reflects back not only the avoidant's feelings, but also the parts of themselves they have long denied or hidden. Avoidants spend much of their lives building walls around their hearts. They have learned, often through early experiences of disappointment, hurt, or neglect, that showing vulnerability is dangerous. To feel too deeply is to risk being hurt, to risk losing control, to risk being overwhelmed. And so they master the art of detachment, the ability to compartmentalize emotion, to rationalize feeling, and to create distance from intimacy. It is a survival mechanism, a carefully constructed fortress designed to keep them safe. Yet the super empath sees through the fortress without aggression or judgment. Their strength is not loud or demanding, it is steady, unshakable, and entirely present. They hold space in a way that is magnetic yet gentle, and this presence has the power to awaken what has been dormant in the avoidant. The mirror effect occurs because the empath, in their emotional clarity, reflects not what the avoidant wants to see, but what the avoidant truly is, often for the first time in their life. This reflection is not a critique, it is a revelation. It shows the avoidant their own suppressed feelings, their buried fears, their unresolved pain, and sometimes the longing they have hidden even from themselves. And for someone who has relied on avoidance as a shield, being faced with this reflection is profoundly unsettling. It is unsettling because it challenges the illusion that detachment is safety. The avoidant may feel a surge of fear, confusion, or even resistance because they are confronted with parts of themselves they have spent years denying. They may feel as though their inner world is being exposed, that the carefully maintained separation between themselves and others is collapsing. But this is precisely why the mirror effect is transformative. The super empath does not force the avoidant to confront these feelings. They simply embody emotional presence so fully that the avoidant has no choice but to notice what is there. This reflection operates on both conscious and subconscious levels. Even when the avoidant resists, even when they attempt to rationalize or withdraw, the empath's energy has already made its mark. Emotions that were buried in shadow begin to stir. Loneliness, grief, longing, or even joy that had been denied are quietly illuminated. The avoid. Ant may initially interpret this as pressure, intrusion, or threat because it feels unfamiliar and uncontrollable. But in truth, it is an invitation, a divine nudge toward self-awareness, self-acceptance, and ultimately emotional liberation. The mirror effect also reveals the avoidance potential for deeper connection. It shows them that vulnerability does not have to equal weakness, and that opening up does not have to mean losing control. The empath demonstrates through their grounded, unwavering energy that it is possible to feel deeply without being consumed. They model a strength that the avoidant has not yet embraced in themselves, a strength rooted in authenticity, compassion, and emotional courage. And because the avoidant sees this strength reflected so clearly, they are forced to confront their own limitations and fears, creating the possibility for profound growth. In this way, the mirror effect is both challenging and healing. It is challenging because it dismantles the avoidant's protective illusions and forces them to meet themselves honestly. It is healing because it offers a glimpse of what life can be like when they no longer hide, when they allow themselves to feel fully, and when they step into their own emotional power. The super empath does not demand change, they simply reflect truth. And for an avoidant, this reflection is the spark that can ignite a journey from fear and avoidance to courage, connection, and self-discovery. Avoidants often navigate life with a strong belief that control is safety. They have learned through experience or circumstance that emotions are unpredictable, that closeness can lead to disappointment, and that vulnerability is a risk to their well-being. Over time, they develop a system of emotional management that feels reliable: distance, detachment, logic, and self-protection. These strategies create the sense that they are in command of their world, that they can steer relationships and life situations without being overwhelmed by feelings they cannot fully contain. To them, control is not arrogance, it is survival, and it is deeply ingrained. When a super empath enters their life, this sense of control begins to feel precarious. The super empath does not attempt to manipulate, dominate, or impose. Instead, their presence is calm, grounded, and intensely aware. They respond to emotions with clarity, understanding, and composure, creating a space where feelings are recognized and held, rather than deflected or dismissed. This can feel threatening to the avoidant, not because the empath intends harm, but because the very structure they rely upon, the illusion of emotional sovereignty, is challenged. The avoidant, who has spent years carefully constructing boundaries to keep chaos and discomfort at bay, suddenly encounters someone whose emotional strength cannot be managed, negotiated, or avoided. The threat is subtle but profound. The avoidant may feel unease, irritability, or even fear without immediately understanding why. The super empath's emotional stability contrasts sharply with the avoidant's internalized strategy of avoidance, highlighting a truth they have long resisted: emotions cannot always be controlled. The super empath mirrors and reflects emotions in a way that gently but unmistakably shows the avoidant that their defenses, while protective, are also limited. What the avoidant perceives as a safe distance from vulnerability is revealed as a barrier to connection, growth, and genuine intimacy. This challenge to control often triggers internal resistance. The avoidant may respond by withdrawing further, rationalizing their discomfort, or attempting to regain a sense of authority in the interaction. They might push back subtly or overtly, attempting to assert that their emotional independence is a choice rather than a coping mechanism. Yet, the empath's energy does not react defensively. It remains steady, consistent, and patient. The avoidant's attempts to control or redirect the emotional flow are met with presence rather than compliance, which can heighten the avoidant's sense of instability. What once felt manageable, their carefully curated distance, now feels inadequate in the face of someone who embodies emotional balance and resilience. This perceived threat is not punishment, it is a doorway. The avoidance of emotions can create a false sense of mastery, but the super empath exposes the limits of that mastery by reflecting back a stable, responsive, and compassionate presence. They show the avoidant that control is not about suppression or detachment, but about understanding, managing, and ultimately integrating emotions. The avoidant begins to recognize that their greatest fear, the loss of control, is often a fear of being overwhelmed by their own feelings. And yet, in witnessing the empath navigate emotions with grace, they glimpse a new paradigm, that surrendering control does not equate to chaos, but can lead to freedom, clarity, and authentic connection. The transformative nature of this dynamic is profound. The avoidant may initially resist, fear, or even push the empath away, but the encounter plants a seed of awareness. They begin to realize that true strength is not rooted in control alone, but in the willingness to face what is within, to feel what they have long avoided, and to embrace connection without defense. The empath does not demand this transformation. They simply reflect what is possible, showing the avoidant that the walls they built to protect themselves can also be walls that block growth, joy, and intimacy. Ultimately, the presence of a super empath reveals a truth that is as liberating as it is unsettling. Control is not about shutting out feelings, but about engaging with them consciously, courageously, and compassionately. And when the avoidant begins to understand this, fear transforms into curiosity, resistance into exploration, and isolation into the potential for profound connection. Avoidants are masters of disguise when it comes to emotion. Over time, they have cultivated the ability to appear composed, confident, and independent, even when their inner world is turbulent, fragile, or conflicted. This mask, carefully constructed, serves a purpose. It shields them from the fear of being seen too deeply, from the possibility of rejection, and from the vulnerability they associate with emotional exposure. They believe that if no one can touch the hidden parts of them, they remain safe. And for years, this strategy can feel like control, like resilience, like freedom. But when a super empath enters the picture, the mask begins to falter, not because the empath pushes or demands, but because their presence has a natural way of cutting through pretense. Super empaths have an uncanny ability to sense what lies beneath surface-level defenses. They feel the subtle tension in a posture, the hesitation in a glance, the unspoken sadness behind a carefully chosen word. They do not need confession or explanation. They perceive and understand intuitively. And when an avoidant is met with this kind of insight, it can feel unsettling, even threatening. The very parts of themselves they have hidden from the world, the fears, insecurities, and longings, are reflected back without judgment. It is as if the empath holds up a mirror that exposes not only what they have tried to protect, but also what they have denied. This unmasking is uncomfortable because it touches the Avoidant at a fundamental level. Vulnerabilities they have avoided acknowledging, even to themselves, suddenly come into focus. There may be a fear of being seen as weak, dependent, or incapable. There may be anxiety that their flaws, past mistakes, or emotional wounds will be met with criticism or rejection. But the super empath does not exploit these vulnerabilities. Instead, they witness them with acceptance, compassion, and steadiness. In doing so, they create a paradoxical environment, one in which the avoidant feels simultaneously exposed and safe. The act of unmasking forces avoidants to confront a truth they often resist, that hiding is not strength, but a defense mechanism that limits authentic connection. They begin to notice the patterns they have repeated in relationships, the retreat when closeness becomes too intense, the rationalization when feelings threaten to surface, the emotional distancing that keeps others at arm's length. The empath's perception illuminates these patterns, not to shame, but to reveal the possibility of something different. The avoidant begins to understand that vulnerability is not a liability, but a doorway to intimacy, trust, and deeper self-understanding. At first, this process can provoke fear, confusion, or even resistance. Avoidants may pull back, retreat into familiar defenses, or test boundaries to regain a sense of control. But with a super empath, these reactions are met not with force, but with patience and presence. The empath holds space for the avoidant's discomfort, allowing them to feel the tension, the fear, and the uncertainty without judgment. Slowly, the avoidant may begin to experience a shift, the realization that vulnerability is not synonymous with danger, and that the walls they have built to protect themselves can also be the walls that prevent them from experiencing life fully. The unmasking of vulnerabilities is transformative because it reveals the avoidant's true capacity for connection. It shows them that being seen, really seen, is not something to fear, but something to embrace. The empath models emotional courage, demonstrating that it is possible to confront one's wounds, accept imperfections, and still be whole, worthy, and loved. Through this reflection, the avoidant begins to understand that authenticity is a form of strength, and that allowing themselves to be known can be profoundly liberating. In essence, the super empath does not break down walls. They invite the avoidant to consider that perhaps the walls are no longer necessary. They reveal that true emotional strength lies not in concealment, but in the willingness to show one's true self, to feel deeply, and to embrace the vulnerability that comes with being fully alive. And as the avoidant begins to lower the mask, they step into a space of greater self-awareness, emotional freedom, and the possibility of authentic, transformative connection. Avoidants have spent years mastering defense mechanisms, strategies, design, to protect them from emotional exposure, intimacy, and perceived danger. They distance themselves when relationships become too intense, intellectualize emotions to avoid feeling them, or rationalize situations to maintain a sense of order and control. These behaviors, while effective in keeping them safe from immediate emotional discomfort, also create a life of partial engagement, a world where feelings are filtered, diluted, or suppressed. They appear composed on the outside, yet inside, emotions that long to be felt are bottled up, waiting for a safe space to emerge. Enter the super empath. Their power is subtle yet undeniable. It is the kind of presence that cannot be rushed, manipulated, or avoided. They do not force the avoidant to confront their defenses, nor do they attempt to dismantle them aggressively. Instead, they simply exist fully, calmly, and deliberately in the moment. This presence, rooted in awareness, compassion, and emotional steadiness, has the uncanny effect of making defenses unnecessary. Walls built through fear and past experience begin to feel heavy, rigid, and redundant when met with someone who does not react to the surface-level turbulence, but instead holds space for what lies beneath. The avoidant may initially resist this presence. They may feel exposed, threatened, or irritated because it challenges the familiar sense of control their defenses provide. To be around someone who can calmly witness their fears, insecurities, and unexpressed emotions without judgment is unfamiliar and, paradoxically, destabilizing. For the first time, the avoidant encounters a person whose strength does not provoke a defensive response, but gently erodes the need for one. The empath's energy is like gravity, quiet, consistent, and unavoidable, pulling the avoidant toward authenticity even if they try to resist. This is where the transformative power of presence lies. It bypasses logic, rationalization, and argument. It does not lecture, insist, or persuade. It simply demonstrates, through consistency and emotional clarity, that true connection does not require masks, manipulation, or avoidance. The avoidant begins to realize that their defense mechanisms, once necessary for survival, are now limiting their capacity for joy, intimacy, and meaningful engagement. The empath's presence makes this realization experiential, not theoretical. It is felt deeply in the body, in the energy of the interaction, and in the subtle shift from tension to curiosity, from fear to engagement. As the avoidant continues to encounter this unwavering presence, their habitual responses, distancing, deflection, and detachment, gradually lose their power. They notice that emotions can be acknowledged without causing collapse, that closeness does not have to be threatening, and that vulnerability does not equate to weakness. The empath demonstrates that it is possible to hold space for emotion, one's own and others, without being overwhelmed, consumed, or destabilized. In witnessing this, the avoidant is invited to experiment with presence themselves, to sit with feelings they would normally flee from, and to experience the freedom that comes from allowing emotions to flow naturally rather than being suppressed or controlled. The power of presence over defense mechanisms is not just about dismantling walls. It is about creating a new template for interaction, a new way of being in the world. The avoidant begins to see that connection does not require armor, that authenticity can coexist with strength, and that emotional honesty is the gateway to both self-understanding and meaningful relationships. The empath's presence models patience, compassion, and resilience, showing the avoidant that strength is not in avoidance, but in embracing reality fully, even when it is uncomfortable. Ultimately, the presence of a super empath teaches the avoidant a subtle but profound lesson. Defense mechanisms may protect temporarily, but they also constrain growth, intimacy, and fulfillment. By embodying emotional stability and grace, the super empath gently invites the avoidant to lower their defenses, not through force, but through example, patience, and unwavering presence. And in that space, the avoidant begins to glimpse a life where feelings are not feared, walls are not necessary, and authentic connection becomes possible, transforming not only how they relate to others, but how they relate to themselves. For an avoidant, emotions are often seen as territories to be navigated with caution. Vulnerability is associated with risk, intimacy is associated with exposure, and surrender is associated with losing control. Over time, this mindset becomes ingrained, forming a protective shell that allows them to move through life without feeling fully seen, fully touched, or fully responsible for the emotional undercurrents of relationships. Emotional surrender, the act of letting go, trusting, and allowing oneself to feel completely, is not simply unfamiliar to the avoidant, it is frightening. It represents the unknown, the uncontrollable, the aspect of human experience they have learned to fear most. When a super empath enters their world, this fear is activated. Super empaths possess a natural ability to create a safe emotional space, one in which feelings can exist without judgment, without criticism, and without immediate consequence. They do not demand the avoidant to surrender. They simply hold presence, understanding, and unwavering calm. And yet for the avoidant, even this quiet invitation feels like a test. To surrender emotionally is to expose the hidden fractures, the past pain, and the unprocessed longing that they have carefully concealed. It is to risk being understood in ways that cannot be controlled or retracted. And while this can trigger fear, it is precisely this fear that signals the potential for transformation. Avoidance often equates surrender with weakness, believing that letting go will leave them vulnerable to rejection, loss, or emotional overwhelm. But the super empath demonstrates something radically different, that surrender does not mean dissolution, but alignment. It is not about losing oneself, but about stepping into the wholeness of one's emotional experience. Through their presence, the empath reveals that emotions, when embraced consciously, can be navigated without destruction. They model resilience, teaching by example that to feel deeply is to live fully, and to allow oneself to trust is to open the door to authentic connection and self-discovery. This fear of surrender also stems from the avoidant's past experiences. Many have learned early on that expressing need or vulnerability can be met with disappointment, abandonment, or misunderstanding. As a result, surrender becomes a foreign language, one they may avoid speaking at all costs. Yet the empath's energy is not coercive. It is patient and consistent, showing that trust can be extended gradually and that the act of opening up can exist alongside safety. The avoidant may initially dip their toes into this space cautiously, testing boundaries, retreating when discomfort arises, and returning when the sense of security holds. Each small moment of surrender becomes a step toward rewriting the narrative they have carried for so long. Moreover, emotional surrender is not a one-way street, it is relational. The super empath provides a mirror in which the avoidant sees that their feelings are acknowledged, devalued, and contained. In doing so, the empath transforms fear into curiosity, tension into exploration, and resistance into willingness. The avoidant begins to understand that letting down their guard does not automatically result in pain, but can instead invite growth, connection, and joy. Surrender, once feared, begins to reveal its power. It opens the heart, dissolves isolation, and allows the avoidant to experience life more fully. The transformative impact of this dynamic is profound. The avoidant may have spent years avoiding emotional depth, yet through consistent exposure to the empath's grounded presence, they begin to sense that surrender is not an act of weakness, but a courageous step toward self-realization. They recognize that the very walls designed to protect them have also limited them, and that letting go of control can lead to liberation rather than harm. Emotional surrender, once terrifying, becomes a doorway, one that invites the avoidant to embrace authenticity, to trust in connection, and to experience life with greater richness, vulnerability, and strength. Through the super empath, the avoidant learns a critical truth. Surrender is not about losing oneself, it is about reclaiming the parts of oneself that have been hidden, ignored, or suppressed. It is the bridge between fear and courage, isolation and intimacy, and avoidance and wholehearted living. And in stepping through that bridge, the avoidant discovers that true emotional freedom is not found in walls or distance, but in the willingness to feel, to trust, and to be fully present. For an avoidant, identity and self-protection are intricately intertwined. They often define themselves through independence, emotional resilience, and the ability to navigate life without reliance on others. Their sense of self has been carefully constructed to maintain safety and autonomy. Vulnerability, intimacy, or overt emotional expression can feel like a threat not only to their security, but also to the very definition of who they are. Their defenses, detachment, rationalization, and emotional distancing are not just strategies, they are integral to their identity. To let those walls down can feel like letting go of themselves entirely. When a super empath enters their world, this carefully maintained equilibrium is challenged. The empath's energy is calm, grounded, and unwavering. They do not demand the avoidant to change, yet their presence embodies a kind of emotional openness that naturally questions the avoidant's reliance on self-protection. Through subtle observation, compassion, and understanding, the empath reflects back not just the avoidant's defenses, but the limitations those defenses impose. The avoidant begins to sense that their identity, built on emotional distance and control, is more fragile than they realized. What once felt like strength may now feel restrictive, constraining their capacity for intimacy, joy, and authentic expression. This confrontation with identity can be deeply unsettling. The avoidant may feel exposed or uncertain, sensing that their core sense of self is being scrutinized without judgment. They may resist, retreat, or assert independence more strongly, fearing that surrendering or opening up threatens who they are. Yet the super empath does not force change, they simply exist in alignment with their own truth, demonstrating that strength and vulnerability are not mutually exclusive. By embodying authenticity, the empath shows that identity can evolve without being destroyed, and that true self-protection is not about walls, but about awareness, discernment, and the capacity to engage fully with life. The empath challenges the avoidance assumptions about what it means to be strong. Avoidants often equate emotional detachment with power, believing that reliance on self-protection ensures resilience. But in witnessing the empath navigate emotional landscapes with clarity, patience, and grace, they are confronted with a different kind of strength, one that comes from presence, emotional courage, and the ability to hold oneself fully while remaining open to connection. This realization can be disorienting because it undermines a foundational belief they have carried for years, that hiding and distancing are essential for survival. Through this subtle yet profound challenge, the avoidant is offered an opportunity for growth. They begin to see that identity need not be rigid, that the self is not threatened by emotional exposure, and that protection can coexist with openness. The empath demonstrates that authenticity, emotional awareness, and vulnerability are not liabilities. They are integral components of resilience. The avoidant begins to understand that self-protection does not require isolation or detachment. It requires discernment, inner strength, and a willingness to engage honestly with their own feelings and the feelings of others. This dynamic often brings internal tension. The avoidant may oscillate between resistance and curiosity, between retreat and engagement. They may test the empath's patience, pushing boundaries to see if their defenses are truly necessary. Yet the empath's unwavering presence models a different paradigm. Trust, consistency, and safety coexist with honesty and vulnerability. Slowly, the avoidant learns that they can expand their sense of self, redefine strength, and experience security in ways that do not rely solely on distance or detachment. In essence, the super empath challenges the avoidant not to dismantle themselves, but to expand. They illuminate a path where identity is flexible, where self-protection is balanced with openness, and where emotional courage strengthens rather than threatens. Through this process, the avoidant discovers that who they are is not fixed by fear, avoidance, or isolation. It is shaped by the willingness to feel, to engage, and to embrace the fullness of their emotional experience. And in this realization, they begin to experience a new kind of liberation, a freedom rooted not in detachment, but in authentic connection, self-awareness, and the courage to evolve. Every encounter with a super empath holds the potential for transformation, particularly for an avoidant who has spent much of their life protecting themselves from emotional exposure. The avoidant's fear of vulnerability, intimacy, and surrender has created patterns that feel familiar, even comfortable, because they provide the illusion of safety. Yet these very patterns also limit growth, closeness, and self-understanding. The presence of a super empath with their unwavering emotional strength offers something radically different. An invitation to step beyond fear, to experience the fullness of emotion, and to embrace a path of personal evolution that the avoidant may not have known was possible. Transformation begins with recognition. The super empath reflects back not only the avoidant's hidden feelings, but also the parts of themselves that are capable of courage, compassion, and connection. This reflection is not accusatory. It is illuminating. It shows the avoidant the potential for a richer, more authentic way of living, one where walls and defenses are no longer necessary, where emotions can be experienced fully without fear, and where connection is a source of strength rather than danger. In seeing this possibility, the avoidant faces a choice: continue hiding behind familiar defenses, or take the first step toward growth, curiosity, and emotional engagement. This opportunity for transformation is often accompanied by discomfort. Avoidants may feel fear, uncertainty, or resistance when confronted with the empath's presence because it challenges their sense of control and self-protection. They may worry about being overwhelmed, rejected, or hurt. Yet it is precisely within this discomfort that growth is found. The empath's steady, compassionate energy creates a safe environment in which the avoidant can explore feelings that were previously off limits. It allows them to experience vulnerability as strength, emotional exposure as empowerment, and connection as a pathway to self-realization. The process is gradual and requires patience. Avoidants may test boundaries, retreat, or revert to old patterns as they navigate this new emotional landscape. Each time, the super empath meets them with calmness and consistency, modeling the very resilience and emotional wisdom that the avoidant is learning to develop. Through repeated exposure to this grounded presence, the avoidant begins to recognize that emotions, intimacy, and vulnerability are not enemies to be feared, but tools for growth and self-discovery. They learn that true strength is not in control or avoidance, but in the willingness to feel fully and authentically. As this understanding deepens, transformation moves beyond behavior into identity. The avoidant begins to realize that they are not defined by fear, avoidance, or emotional detachment. They see that their identity can evolve, that self-protection can coexist with openness, and that the capacity to connect deeply is not a threat, but a profound gift. Each step towards surrender, authenticity, and engagement strengthens their resilience, cultivates emotional intelligence, and deepens their sense of purpose. Ultimately, the opportunity for transformation and growth offered by the super empath is nothing short of a spiritual awakening. It calls the avoidant to expand beyond the limitations of fear and defense, to embrace the richness of emotional experience, and to cultivate courage, empathy, and presence in their own life. What was once perceived as dangerous, the intensity of emotions, the exposure of vulnerabilities, the surrender of control, becomes the very catalyst for liberation, self-mastery, and authentic connection. In this journey, the avoidant discovers that fear is not a barrier, but a signal pointing to where transformation is possible. They learn that the walls they built to protect themselves can be transformed into bridges that connect them to deeper intimacy, greater self-awareness, and a life imbued with meaning. The empath does not force this growth. They model it, reflect it, and hold space for it. The avoidant's engagement with this energy becomes a mirror through which they can see their own potential, recognize their own resilience, and step into a version of themselves that is more authentic, emotional, capable, and profoundly alive. In the end, the presence of a super empath illuminates a timeless truth. The path to growth, healing, and transformation is always through courage, awareness, and the willingness to face what we fear most. For the avoidant, this journey transforms fear into opportunity, isolation into connection, and avoidance into a life rich with emotional depth, personal freedom, and the transformative power of genuine human connection. Thank you for allowing me to share these insights with you. May they inspire courage, growth, and authentic connection in your journey. Goodbye for now, and remember, every step toward vulnerability is a step toward freedom and transformation.